Now then, we got a new patch. I did a video yesterday going over the patch notes, and bit of a spoiler, but not too pleased with the changes. I think there was definitely some better changes that could have been made, but it's a new season. There's things to try out. Of course, I'm back with a 6 faction, 6 decks. Now, if you've watched my videos for a while, you'll probably know what this is, but for anyone who's coming in new, these are going to be one deck for each faction that I'm looking to play this season, to varying degrees. Now, get the disclaimer in, this isn't like a meta snapshot, these aren't the best decks for each faction, these are just the things that I personally find interesting and want to play myself, and it's kind of there as it's some ideas for you. If especially in pro rank where you need to play multiple factions, you can't just stick to one. Having multiple decks helps out quite a bit. Um, if you have any suggestions for like changes to any of the decks in this video, please drop comments below because obviously I'm going to be using this. If you've got some good ideas, I'm all ears. And also chuck down any decks you might have as well, and use this video as kind of a central point for like resources and different decks and that kind of thing. So yeah, we got a few decks to cover, so I'll go right into them. Now, starting off with monsters. Admittedly, this one isn't too different to what I was kind of running last season for vampires, mainly because there hasn't really been any changes. None of the monsters cards saw any relevant changes. And the only actual change I've made is because Ring of Favour's gone up in provisions, that needed a change anyway. And so I put in Teshin Mutner Sword because, I mean, yesterday I said I thought it sounded quite good, and then I sat and thought about it for a bit longer and thought, actually, this card's kind of busted now. And in Vampires, it feels like an auto-include. So if you didn't see what the change was, it is now damages a unit by 5, and it repeats once for each status that unit has. So this cuts through Nova like a hot knife through butter, because that has resilience, veil, and shield. So it'll take 5 damage and then another 15 damage. So it's just going to cut through anything. And it really makes sense in monsters because you're kind of running a lot of stuff that is going to put statuses on, namely bleeding. So with your many ways of getting bleeding onto different units, you just chuck bleeding onto something, and now your Teshin Mutner Sword will hit it for 10. So it turns bleeding that might not be that scary to your opponent into just instant removal of the vast majority of stuff. Not to mention it'll cut through basically every defender in the game. It'll cut through Donomir, Covenant of Steel. It will put a Cave Troll down to 1, I believe. But if you put bleeding on it, it'll kill it straight away. It'll cut through. Am I forgetting? Cut through Figgis. Basically, the only thing it won't go through is Azar because it gets the 2 bodies. A little bit awkward, but bleeding kind of sorts them out anyway. The defenders become no problem. And we're just running typical kind of Golden Necker stuff with Nova, Erendite. And the general idea is we're looking to get a ton of Fledders down. We have Operator to get Fledders. We have Megascopes. We also have Idoran to kind of work with those Megascopes and with Operator. In that, so the nice interaction with Idoran and Megascope is if you play your Megascope and it takes like its turn to spawn, you can then play Idoran, and then at the end of the turn, the Megascope will proc, spawn the 4-power Fledder, Idoran spawns another. He's a little expensive for basically just getting a 1-power Fledder, but still seems worth it, to be honest. Fledders are kind of a win con for you. The more you can get down, the better. And we're also running an Incubus because Operator will give both you and your opponent a Fledder, and you can just Incubus to bring back their Fledder and therefore your Fledder, which is generally a pretty nice combination. I'm not running 2 just because it can get inconsistent, but it's pretty fun. Pretty fun. I mean, anyone who's watched my videos knows I love a bit of vampires. So yeah, I'm definitely going to be going with this for monsters. For Nilfgaard, we are going with Ball. So kind of a weird one. Right at the back end of the season, I tried out Ball again because I thought the way the meta's looking, a really control heavy kind of deck would probably perform quite decently. And I found it did, pretty well. Um, like borderline one of the better choices for Nilfgaard right now. Because Assimilate's just kind of dropped off. It just can't really compete anymore, which I'm very surprised by. I think the nerfs have finally caught up with Assimilate. Uh, those continual provision changes have just made it feel a little weak because you just can't afford to run the stuff you want to run, quite simply. And then in the new patch, they give a buff to Masquerade Ball, which is very nice. Extra provision. And not a great deal has changed in terms of the list. I obviously put in a Session Mutton Sword because, as I kind of touched upon earlier, it's kind of nuts. In a deck that runs Imprisonment and a ton of poisons, you've played against Nilfgaard. When have you ever played against Nilfgaard and there's not been a million units on your side with a status like a poison or a lock, or I mean we're running Philippe, so we can give things a million statuses, and Teshin Mutton Sword is just going to delete everything on the board. So yeah, that's the general plan with the deck. Is we're just stopping our opponent generating anything, and trying to squeeze out a few points ourselves. And typically has performed pretty well. Obviously, it is not like the heyday of Ball when it was absolutely dominating and felt kind of ridiculous, but it can still perform now. It still does its job. Still does its job very well. Poison to remove tall stuff is always nice, and there's a few points in there too. Things like Philippe just clearing everything off the board, and of course you got Blight Makers, which are a lot of points. And last little bit is we have Jan Calvert, so we have a ton of consistency. Because the problem with playing Ball before was missing Ball, because missing Ball was a very common thing. But now with Jan Calvert, you have a bit more consistency and actually finding it, which feels really, really nice. So yeah, Nilfgaard, don't expect I'll play tons of games with Nilfgaard, but I will definitely be trying out Ball for Nilfgaard for sure. The next up, we have Northern Realms, and I'm going back to Commandos. Anyone, I mean, I hate to say it, but Priestess functionally hasn't changed. I mean, you can't really use teleportation on her, but most of the decks just run Roach and use it as a finisher and don't run teleports anyway, so that hasn't really changed. But I'm not going that route. I want to try Commandos again. I've been off Commandos for quite a while now. A muted generator seemed kind of fun. So the reason being, when you play your blue stripe commander, it's gonna buff all of the commandos in your deck, which seems kind of good. Haven't had time before this video to try it out yet. I was trying another couple of decks, but commandos is generally already really good. Well, I said really good. It can definitely compete. It's obviously not NR's strongest option by any means, but it's still decent. We got a couple of weird things in there. So we got King Belhoon because I feel like he's a little bit slept on as a card. I don't think he's insanely good, but I think for 8 provisions, creating a card that, plays for 6 on deploy, and even if you just get, say, a Dahlia, or like a Kerak City Guard or a Kerak Marine boosted up by 3, it would be for each of those, then he's already played for 9, which seems kind of good. Seems very, very good. I've also put in Dandelion because if we're going muted generator, we're just going to be piling on the carryover. Now, obviously, you could run a Scroll for a bit more consistency, but I like to live on the wild side. I like to live on the wild side and go even more high rolly. I think you could also try, which I think is a good version, arguably maybe better than this version, is throwing in Siege, just putting in the Siege sort of engines, put in Siege, put in your Siege Masters, chuck in like a couple of Caraballistas, a couple of reinforced Trebuchets, you're kind of good to go. drop out like Margarita, probably have to drop like Bellahoon, Dandelion, and just go with that. But I wanted to try this version out and see how I feel. Now, I'll like quickly explain how to play commandos if you never played them. Really simple. You run a million and one ways to put more commandos into your deck. So King Foltest will do that. Um, the Blue Stripe Scouts will do that. Adelia will let you play another Blue Stripe Scout. Reinforcements will let you play another Blue Stripe Scout. And so you can get a lot of Blue Stripes commandos out in a turn. Mainly looking to do that in round 1, especially if your Foltest isn't answered. You can just keep generating turn after turn after turn. It's kind of stupid. And then you're going to use Princess Pavetta to put all of those commandos back in your deck. So then finally, in a really short round 3, you can just pull out commandos all over again and basically fill a row, which will play for 9 4s of 36. So 36 points if they are boosted, which is kind of good. Kind of really good, to be honest. Obviously, this kind of deck has been a little bit power crept, but yeah, that's the idea. It's not too difficult of a deck, but it's a good one to sit back and relax with. I'll definitely be enjoying this on a couple of late nights. Now, for Scoia'tael, I think you'll maybe look at this and think, okay, that's weird. And I did at first glance, but it's really good, to be fair. So this is a list that one of my legacy teammates, I believe it was Dan or I, put in. I think a few of them have been using something similar. But the idea of this is like a super control kind of Scoia'tael. And I had to make a few changes because I tried it at the back end of last season and seemed decent, but obviously there's been changes to Vanadane and Ring of Favour, so I needed to mess about with some of the provisions. But it seems pretty good. I've been having a lot of success with this deck, to be honest. So the general idea is you're doing the whole Vanadane for quadruple waylay, similar stuff. And then the combination of Zoltan Warrior and Munro Boys and Zoltan's Company means you can get a lot of points there. They're kind of your two big point areas. And you run a lot of removal in the form of your leader, which is naturally good removal. Erendite, because none of our units are going tall, we've got on it Sensor. I put in a Tesham Mutner Sword because, as I kind of mentioned in Monsters, I think it's kind of cracked as a card. Even if this just hits something with 1 status and deals 10, it's already really good. And yeah, I've found this deck's pretty good, to be honest. In terms of when to use Monroe, there's kind of 2 situations where you're going to get full value. Either you use Zoltan Warrior and get 2 dwarves spawned, and then you use a Dwarven Chariot to get another 2, so you've got 4 set up. You can switch 3 of those to Berserkers, job's good in, or you can just Zoltan's Company, because that's going to spawn you 4, because we're running Scoundrel and Warrior, so we get 4 Rowdy Dwarves. Obviously, that has now been nerfed down from 5, which is a little bit sad, but it still works. It still works for what we're trying to do. And I've found the combination of both the Simbless and like the Munro kind of big point slams. If you have to use like 1 in a round 2 bleed or something, and then 1 to sort of finish off in round 3, you're usually pretty good. If you can get both off in 1 turn, 1. And Zoltan Scoundrel is surprisingly good because you end up with quite full rows because you've got Zoltan's Company, your leader, you play 4 waylays, there's going to be a lot of Deadeye spawning, so you end up with a lot of kind of awkward stuff for your opponent to deal with spawning on the board, and then you can just buff them up a little bit with Zoltan Scoundrel. And of course you need a Zoltan for Zoltan's Company to actually be good. So yeah, I've been really enjoying this deck, and I think I'm probably just going to use this to go from rank 3 to pro rank like today, because it's very, very good. Very, very good. I played like 2 games of it this morning. Both of them were very, very simple games. So yeah, I think it's a really good deck, to be honest. So for Skellige, we are running a control list that I was kind of trying out. I think at the moment Skellige's kind of struggling a little bit. Maybe the 5th or 6th faction at the moment, but this is something I'm going to be using. I tried it out at the back end of the season, and it seemed okay. Um, a lot of the value comes from the fact that Magic Compass can just win you games, just straight up win you games at the end. Because you have so many options for stuff you can do. You know, Kusha a lot of the time is just like a standard plays for a lot of points kind of play. Get another, get another coral, whatever you need. But things like Dire Bear, Arna Chad, um, whatever, I forgot his name. Um, the bloody chicken. Uh, can be, so your opponent discards the last card if you're already ahead. There's a lot of kind of options for daft stuff that can work out. And if you just want points, you can just go Lippy, get Roach and Knickers back out the deck, and he just plays for 10. So there's tons of options there. And a lot of the other cards we're just playing for solid value. It's the typical kind of mid-rangey control reckless flurry list with a lot of the new tools in there. Now, as I kind of mentioned, I think Skellige are falling behind a little bit. While some of the other decks have got some interesting new tools and can definitely perform, Skellige's kind of stayed stagnant. They have a few good options and can still compete. Completely can still compete, but yeah, sometimes they can struggle a little bit. But I will still be using this nonetheless. I think there's definitely room for some of the new changes to maybe invigorate this deck a little bit. You know, maybe like Sahil. I think the card's probably not that great, but maybe something there. But I haven't cracked anything yet. If I come up with something, I'm sure I'll do a video on it, but right now, this is what I'll be going with. And I think it's solid for Skellige. You can't go wrong. The only problem is there's a lot of decision making involved. Until you're super comfortable with this deck and you've played many games where you learned from your mistakes in effect, because there's a lot of decision making involved. You're going to make mistakes, so I think it's a more skill intensive kind of deck. I think you're definitely going to have a bit of a learning curve on this one, but it's enjoyable nonetheless. To round us off, we have Syndicate, and we're getting clowny as anything. This is the list I put together semi recently, about a week or so ago, which is like a double collusion kind of list. And it kind of surprised me that it's actually decent, basically. I was not expecting it to perform as well as it did. But I'm not going to complain. There's been a couple of changes. So somebody actually mentioned it in a comment. I got your name. I'm really sorry. But they mentioned Room Mage, and I'd already been kind of had that in the back of my mind. And seeing someone else kind of agree hit me over the edge, and I was like, okay, we're putting Room Mage in. Took out Professor, didn't feel like we needed him, and then chucked in a Slice Seductress. And I think that's about it for the changes. But the general idea with this, I would encourage you, if you do want to use this deck, probably have a look at my video on this deck, because there's a few decision making things involved that can seem a little awkward. But the general idea is we're looking to get a really high value collusion, and we can use Alyssa to either use collusion a second time or get a second Shoop, depending on what the situation requires. And because of Room Mage, it means that regardless of which Shoop we pick, we get to see all 5 options, so there's no decisions kind of involved there. And Room Mage also helps with Shady Vendor, gives us more options on the crimes we can play. So all in all, very solid. A lot of the value you'll get from this is the surprise factor, because your opponent is going to expect this. Who in the right mind is playing collusion? You're definitely going to get some games where you're going to have a distinct advantage because your opponent has no clue what you're doing, so they don't really know how to stop you. Like, for example, Shady Vendor. They'll look at Shady Vendor and think, okay, it's played its deploy, I don't need to kill a 4-power body. But that 4-power body is going to be worth another 8 points off 2 collusions. Maybe more, actually. No, 10 points off 2 more collusions. So that's kind of what I mean. Really awkward for your opponent to deal with because they just no clue what you're doing. And the last little interaction I will talk about because I love this interaction so much. So the Eternal Fire Inquisitor, that's the card that destroys a Fire Spawn token and then spawns it after 2 turns. Now, the way this works is it stores, when it's in your graveyard, it stores what token it destroyed. So if you use this onto a smuggle, for example, it'll store that it killed a footman, and it will kind of say, if you click on the card and have a look at its description, it will say it will spawn a footman. So then if you use Cyrus Hemmelfart to bring it back from the graveyard, at the end of your next turn, it's going to respawn that token. So for 2 coins, you can turn a Zealot, which is 2 points, into a 4-power unit that's going to spawn a 3-power unit. And 5 points for 2 coins is the most efficient way you can possibly spend. Love the interaction. So that's something to keep in mind. You want to get your Eternal Fire Inquisitor down early to get an absolutely insane Hemmelfart. So that will do it for us. I think there's plenty of stuff for you to be getting on with here. Plenty of decks to try out, and there certainly is for me. Definitely be giving a go with all of these, and expect to see videos covering at least 1 video for each of these decks, sort of going over it in a bit more depth over the next week or 2. Maybe by the end of this week. Depends how busy I am, quite simply. So, hope you've enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next one.